So I actually wrote the first draft of this sermon with a pen and some old scratch paper. It's all just here, lots of different sheets, and a little bit messy. And that's not so unusual or out of the ordinary a thing to do, perhaps, writing with pen and paper. But for my generation, especially as a current grad student, it certainly is. This may be the first time I've written anything longer than a birthday card on paper since probably about the 8th grade. So this return to the old-fashioned way of doing things was unusual and an interesting take for writing this sermon. And so why, you ask? Because this week my computer broke. And as many of you may know or can understand who use computers regularly, which I imagine is quite a few of you, that machine did just about everything for me. All day, every day, for about the last decade, the archive of my life has been built on that computer. So in dealing with this colossal annoyance, I've had to run around to computer shops in between class. I've taken Zoom meetings and I have an iPhone mini, so a really small screen. I've been typing my homework on my phone and then spending time on the phone with IT support, and not to mention, of course, the money. So in short, it's been a whole ordeal, and it's tested the limits of my patience at times and my technological abilities. But I am certain that I am not the only one who's had to deal with an ordeal this week. Your examples and experiences likely range from similar, relatively minor inconveniences or just a litany of benign annoyances to some real tough situations that are exhausting, flabbergasting, saddening, or downright angering you. Does any of that sound familiar? But why, you're probably wondering then, did I start off this sermon by telling you this story, dusting off my stress from the week onto all of you on this glorious Sunday morning? Well, one, it's to remind you to back up your hard drives, go home and do it. You have no excuse not to. Everyone needs to. And two, because in the chapter we're focusing on this week in Acts, chapter 28, Paul is facing more than his fair share of ordeals. And I know that comparison is the thief of happiness or joy, but if I had to say, I would guess that Paul had it a lot worse than I did this week. So by the point at which we arrive to this story, he's really gone through the ringer. The context we don't get and hear from this reading is that he, along with all the other prisoners aboard that ship to Rome, have just been shipwrecked. That's covered in chapter 27. They are heading towards Rome, where Paul hopes to continue his mission of supporting early churches, even as he's technically under arrest by Roman authority for all the societal rabble-rousing he's causing. He and his companions, Roman centurions and fellow prisoners alike, luckily wash up on an island, and by the kindness of some strangers there, are offered food and warmth amidst the storm. But as each of us may empathize from our own related experiences, very little is worse than a wet, chilly storm when you're hungry, lost, and on an unfamiliar island. All this, and then he gets bitten by a snake, thus garnering a false accusation on top of it all as a murderer. So since the snake was believed to be in cahoots with the cosmic forces of justice, its bite was assumed to signify a sort of divine punishment for Paul. So, oh my gosh, all of this piles on. And in short, what an ordeal. Despite it all, as we read, Paul miraculously survives the snake bite, ends up getting called a god, and cures the terrible illness of the father of the island's leader. Peace is restored amongst the crew, provisions are offered, and away they sail once the storm has cleared. The miraculous dynamic that I want to highlight here is that at the edges of what have to have been peak physical discomfort and inconvenience, and likely some fear too, as Paul is still a prisoner, Paul, through his miracles of healing, continues to be a conduit for the mission of love. It could have been the end of the story for him, but his choices forced the hand of the narrative, creating a story which we now read in our contemporary context as the incredible dramatic buildup to Paul's final moments of freedom and preaching before he's physically imprisoned in Rome. In the midst of just such a set of ordeals, we too are confronted with choice. We get to decide by what authority and with what sets of beliefs we navigate the stormy seas, the snake bites, the ship, and the train wrecks of our lives. Stranded on an island, what miracles do we still believe in and witness? So now that we have our scriptural context, let's return to my computer story for just a moment. Because what I didn't tell you as I narrated that situation at the beginning was about my inner dialogue and the thoughts at play in my head through it all. And admittedly, this is all accentuated by the fact that I knew I was offering this sermon on Acts this week, which is sort of the pinnacle classic story of bringing the life and the teachings of Jesus to the world. I just kept thinking about what the choices I made said about what I actually believe and how I actually choose to act when push comes to shove. There were two themes that emerged pretty clearly for me from this. The first is that I can trust in my community and I can trust in God to provide for what I need. I was so distraught and distracted trying to figure out how to make the logistics of a week without a computer work, I nearly forgot to settle myself, breathe, and even pray. And what's so beautiful about prayer is that in that quiet space, I could hear God's wisdom. I could hear an inner voice of peace that wants what's good for me, and it told me this: lean on your community, ask for help, tell people what's going on, and receive the grace that they offer, receive the humor, receive the jokes, slow the pace so that blessings don't go zooming by. I thought about the scriptural stories of communities relying on one another for their needs that we've been reading, and tried to not just materially, but spiritually imagine myself held by a team larger than myself. Okay, so ask for help, be in community, trust that God's presence, wisdom, and work is found in prayers and at church, yes, but also in the advice and the support from my friends, my family, and even strangers. I have a second example of how this story reminded me that I am actually writing my own life into a far longer, comprehensive story about love that stretches back thousands of years ago. The lesson reminds me that I am a torchbearer, a representative of a mission, and that each moment I must choose to represent that. And the lesson is to treat people well and patiently. It was so easy to want to be short with the people in that computer repair shop because it just felt like the overwhelm was so much. It was pulling all of my attention away from trivial formalities like being kind or whatever. And so it was really tricky. But when Paul is soaked on an island, hungry and imprisoned, he finds the willpower to heal himself, another man, and then many more. His mission of love didn't get put on hold because it was just too much effort for him at that time. And I tell you, being overly generous with the people in the computer shop was good for everyone. I know it healed me in some ways, and I hope that they felt it too. We laughed, which eased my stress, and they reassured me that they were going to do everything in their power to help. This lesson reminded me that each ordeal has a possible script out of it that follows a path of patience and kindness. And importantly, it reminded me that being a kind person who sees someone in distress and discomfort and lights a fire, as the Malta residents did, or brings warmth in any way to a situation, can make a world of difference in somebody's day. So what are your commitments in the midst of an ordeal that you fall back on? Are you committed to being in and supporting your community, being a fire tender of kindness to someone lost in a storm, stuck on an island? There are endless possibilities for how you will carry the story forward. We can look to the collection of sermons many of us have heard over the course of the past few weeks during this Unstoppable series and glean a few sort of starting ideas from there. These lessons might choose from committing to acts and committing to movements that disruptively innovate and shake up the status quo in the name of justice and in the name of love, to participating in practices of radical inclusion where no matter what, who you are dealing with, the circle is drawn to include them in your community, to leaning all the way into actions that help us live fully alive, holding none of our gifts back. These are just some examples drawn from the past month alone of themes that we could center in our lives moving forward, now that this ACT series at church is officially complete. And I want to provide one more example borrowed from recent events in the news, actually just this week that I found on Facebook. And I offer this vignette as an example for how two people are actively creating, writing with their actions, their next chapter after an ordeal. Two of my favorite musicians, some of you may have heard of them, they've played in the Boston area, but their names are Alistair Fraser and Natalie Haas, arrived in Portland, Oregon to play a show about a week ago. They're a Scottish fiddle and cello duo, and so as such, of course, had all of their instruments in their rental car. And unfortunately, the car was broken into, and so all of their incredibly valuable, very old, precious instruments and equipment were stolen. This story is still running all over the Portland local news. You can look it up, and it's so terrible, of course, what happened. But I thought of this story as a case for highlighting how two people harness a moment of precarity, holding no control over the ordeal of their material circumstances, yet writing their way through with integrity, courage, and grace. They continued to be conduits for their and their community's love of music. They played the show on borrowed instruments. Then the next day, designed and hung missing posters with the support of friends and strangers alike all over the city of Portland. Alistair Fraser has spent the last week talking with community members, trying to identify where their belongings might have gone, appealing to his emotional and historical attachment to the instruments. He shares stories of love about these objects. He does not come across in these interviews as vindictive. He and his touring partners' lives have encountered a limit, an ending in some ways even, yet they choose to not make it an ending for their tour, but rather a beautiful and, at this point, global community project of instrument recovery, solidarity, and compassion. So we return to this driving question that asks, when you've hit a limit, be it a physical one, a theological limit, or an intellectual one, where do you go from there? We've been focusing a lot on the past few months on how Paul, in his missionizing efforts, hits resistance and judgment and countless challenges, and such ordeals are represented in our scripture reading for today. But as our sermon series on this topic wraps up concurrently with Paul's travels, we have the chance to look at and conclude with a new aspect of his story. Starting today, he hits the limits of his missionizing travels, becomes physically imprisoned, and from here on out must complete his mission using just the medium of letter writing to show his support for early Christian communities. We too cross certain thresholds of familiarity or comfort in life all the time and are presented, just as Paul was, with the chance to continue to show steadfast commitment to carrying the mission of Jesus forth. With these opportunities, we get to keep writing and creatively constructing what the next iteration of this movement will look like. And the fun part is that we're all doing this together at the same time, so we're not doing that story writing alone. We can all play different roles from each other. I don't need to express Jesus' love and remind the world and its people of their value in the same way that you do or that you do. It's so much better that we do this in a way that aligns with our strengths and our gifts and our circumstances. And of course, the context has changed a lot since the time of Paul. So while it's important that we write our own unique story of how the work of Acts continues to be seen and made known in the world today, it's also important to view ourselves in a collective context, one in which we're all working towards bringing the messages of Jesus into a contemporary and dramatically different world than when the original book of Acts was being written. What might have made sense back then doesn't make much sense now. Technology has changed the ways we relate to one another. Communication forms and networks have grown. Theological commitments and identities have taken on multiple complex layers of meaning. And our treatment of religious difference has generally evolved quite a bit, though often, not always, as we know, for the better. So, our imagination for what the next stage of this Acts story looks like needs an operating system update, so to speak. And by the way, I figured out that that's actually all my computer needed. They figured it out, and it's working fine now. Okay, so thus, what I'm suggesting is that not only are we attentive to ways of expressing the values of Jesus that demonstrate God's kingdom at play in earth and in our lives, but that we do so in ways that speak to the place and moment we are living in. For example, in our scriptural passage from today, we read that Paul survives a snake bite, heals a man sick with fever and dysentery while on the island of Malta, both of which are seen as proof of the power of God expressing through human action. How might we understand such miraculous events today? Brushing off a snake bite might look for you like finding the strength to ignore a mean comment, the patience to get through an unexpected setback, or simply remembering to connect with the truth of ourselves when injury strikes, that we are made in the image of God and therefore capable of miraculous healing. Healing another may happen by supporting and thanking medical workers, or keeping sick, hurt, or suffering community members in our prayers and uplifting them with food, company, and comfort. These are just some examples of ways of bringing acts of love to the world in our present day, borrowing the imagery and ideas from our reading of Acts. Where does this all land us? When you are caught in a story, a relationship, an ordeal, nearing the end of a season, an era, a Bible passage, yes, even a sermon series, then you have the opportunity to decide what the next chapter is that you are going to write for yourself. And remember, it's not all about changing material circumstances beyond our control, but reconnecting and recommitting to our theological foundation and allowing our choices and our actions to flow from that foundation. Whatever it is that you decide, let's call it Acts 29. Since the canonical book of Acts ends at chapter 28, we get to grab the torch and carry the story forth. Not everyone is going to be, nor should be, just like Paul. When he hits Rome, he speaks to the crowds, but soon after is imprisoned and shifts his mission to, of all things, a letter writing practice. What will your practice be? How will your Acts 29 look? What will the theological, spiritual, practical commitments you make be? And how will you choose to show them to the world? Remember, you don't have to do that all at once. Find a handful of takeaways that really resonated with you from this series on the unstoppable power that the life of Jesus had, and use that to steer your choices. And you can experiment with it. How will you play a part in getting the message of love out? Maybe it's starting this week when you cook for others with great love, are a generous host, are a gracious guest, or a volunteer somewhere, maybe even starting with our food collection efforts after church today. In whatever ways you choose, you can look around and, just as Paul does in Acts 28, verse 15, You can find the courage to keep going, keep creating, keep writing your story when you see other people surrounding you on that very same mission. And may it be so.